Well, the first thing that is going to happen is that the airline is going to be cutting jobs. It's planning to cut around 3,000 jobs, so that's about 15% of its workforce. And it's also going to be negotiating with trade unions and with staff about things like a salary cut and unpaid leave for staff to be taking. Now, in results released this morning, the airline said that it had um, revenues were up 10% on the year before, and profit was also up 13%. So that's good news for the company. However, this year is going to be a very different year from the one before, unsurprisingly. They're expecting a loss of 200 million euros in the second quarter of the year, and they've also cut their passenger target. They've cut it down to 80 million for the year, and that's a sharp reduction from the original number of 154 million passengers for the coming year. But of course, it's hard for airline carriers to be making sales forecasts at the moment, particularly as we just don't know what the demand is going to be like for the busy summer holiday season. But Ryanair is planning to resume at least 40% of its flights by July. Now, the carrier has also refused state aid. It's even criticised other airlines who have accepted and taken advantage of government bailout schemes. Now, Ryanair seems to be feeling fairly confident about its prospects and its opportunities for growth in a post-pandemic world. And that's partly because they're sitting on cash reserves of 4 billion euros, which does provide the carrier with a little bit of margin. And of course, this is reassuring investors. As trading opened in Europe this morning, shares for Ryanair jumped up nearly 8%.
Now, Germany last week was the latest European country to go into a recession officially. And this week, it's the turn of Japan, which has just announced 2 straight quarters of contraction, a technical recession. So why has Japan been hit so hard?
Well, Japan is in a particularly vulnerable position because it's based between 2 key players in the pandemic. There's China and the US. Now, China, of course, is the country where the pandemic originated, but the US is the country in the world that has been the hardest hit by coronavirus. And Japan relies on these 2 countries for trade. Now, Japan's economy shrank 3.4% in the first quarter. That's its biggest fall since 2015. Now, the economy was already struggling before the pandemic began, and that's due in part to a new consumption tax that the government put in place in October last year. So that's, of course, before people really even knew about the coronavirus. But of course, now we're in the pandemic in 2020. Fast forward to this year, and the pandemic has really become the nail in the coffin for the Japanese economy. Now, the bulk of the contraction is linked to private spending. People in Japan simply don't want to buy things at the moment, and that's also due to the manufacturing sector in Japan, as production lines across the country have screeched to a halt because of the crisis. Analysts say that there is going to be worse to come. In the second quarter of this year, they're predicting a slump of as much as 22%, which of course would be the worst ever decline for the country.